Hoje temos a sorte de ter Dan Cameron, thank you for coming, e o Sergio Martins como mediador. E o tema é legitimação. Era legitimação? Sim. Legitimação. Passar a palavra para o Jesus.
We have Dan Cameron, who is the creator of the Orange County Museum in LA, and Sergio Martins, who's a very well-known art historian from here, from Rio de Janeiro. They're going to be introducing a discussion about legitimization. That is one of the issues that is more important to contemporary art since maybe since the beginning of contemporary art, where Marcel Duchamp did his first ready-mades. I'm going to introduce very briefly Sergio, and Sergio is going to do the same thing with Dan. Then Dan is going to give us his presentation, and as we have been doing with all the other person that has been talking during these Conversas, Sergio is going to ask some questions to Dan so we can get into a kind of dialogue. And of course, I'd invited to do any questions in case that you think is that you want to participate in this dialogue. Sí. Sergio Martins is a professor at the History Department at Pontificia Universidad Católica here in Rio de Janeiro. He received his master and his PhD in History of Art from the University College in London. He was the guest editor for Third Text, a very important cultural studies magazine in England. He was a guest editor for the special issue called Bursting on the Scene, looking back at Brazilian art. It was a number devoted to contemporary Brazilian art. And his book is a great book called Constructing an Avant-Garde, Art in Brazil, 1949-1979, was published last year by MIT Press, and I highly recommend that you read it. It's a great book. So now I leave you with Sergio, who's going to introduce them. Thanks. Thanks and welcome.
Well, many thanks for the generous introduction, Jesus. And, bom, eu vou primeiro apresentar o Dan em português, porque o currículo dele ele mesmo já conhece. Dan Cameron é curador-chefe do Orange County Museum of Art em Newport Beach, e ele está nesse cargo desde janeiro de 2012. Antes de trabalhar no OCMA, ele foi diretor artístico da US Biennial, que produz o Prospect New Orleans, uma das maiores bienais internacionais de arte contemporânea dos Estados Unidos. E antes disso, ele foi curador sênior do New Museum of Contemporary Art em Nova York, de 95 até 2006, né? Portanto, uma longa experiência, da qual, enfim, algumas exposições com a qual nós certamente somos familiares surgiram. Destacaria, por exemplo, a exposição Cildo Meirelles no ano 2000, que veio aqui para o Rio de Janeiro, no Museu de Arte Moderna, e que, enfim, pelo menos para mim, foi minha primeira grande exposição onde eu vi a obra do Cildo. Então, por essa razão, é um grande prazer poder apresentar o Dan. E I think, Jesus, it's worth perhaps reading your provocation on legitimization to contextualize the public before giving the word to Dan, if you're all right with that. So I'm going to read, just kind of read the way Jesus interestingly framed this discussion and the concept of legitimization. And so I'm quoting you. Collecting is directly related to the process of legitimizing an art object. Both the object and the collection mutually benefits and contaminates each other. In the specific case of public collections, museums, the object is placed in a time-space flux that gives it its historical inscription. According to some historians, the mainstream museum's legitimization process works by placing the object in a transhistorical space, which allows for decontextualization of the object's cultural, political, social, and economic conditionings. At the same time, this decontextualization operates a purification process, transforming the art object into a fetish or object of contemplation. This model, which has been the prevalent one for public art collections during modern times, leaves aside the model of art as a process of communication. This collision between the transhistorical model and the communication model is a key to understand what collecting means in terms of contemporary art production. And so it is with this interesting provocation that I'll pass the word to Dan, who will certainly speak about his experience, and then we'll have our conversation between us and with you afterwards. Thanks, Dan.
Thank you, Sergio. Thank you, Jesus. I'm going to use this mic right now because I'm going to use my hands to do other things. First of all, I want to thank ArtRio for having me. I haven't been back to Rio in a few years, and I'm really excited to be part of this set of discussions today. Because further away. Can people hear me okay? Is the volume all right? Okay, thank you. So I wanted to contextualize what I'm doing now in terms of my previous curatorial practice. And my objective for doing this is partly because, although Sergio mentioned I've been more than 30 years a curator, it's my first time working in a museum with a collection. And the kind of experiences that I'm having right now are making me reflect back on my previous roles as a curator, exhibition maker, and as a critic, and think about them in a different way. So this is a great opportunity for me to be able to kind of construct some ideas that are new for me for the present occasion. We're going to start this discussion with some of my work at the New Museum. I joined the New Museum in '95 at a time when there was a desire to make a more international program. My paradigm was Les Magiciens de la Terre in 1989, which was the first, was considered for many years the first global art exhibition. Later historical work reveals that, in fact, the Biennale of Havana in 1984 was 5 years ahead. But nonetheless, I felt that it was extremely important to balance two ideas. One was the importation of important art from elsewhere. And as an American, you can imagine that importing artists from Europe in the 80s and the 90s seemed to have a very high priority. The image you're looking at right here is Marcel Odenbach, the German artist who is a pioneer of video art in the 70s, and this was the first retrospective that Odenbach had in the United States. And we presented that 2 years after I arrived at the New Museum. Maybe I point it. Perfect. The other idea was to bring artists to the attention of a New York public for the first time. So here you see two images from an exhibition I organized in 1998, Los Carpinteros from Cuba. We're seen in the United States for the first time in this exhibition, as was Shrivani Neuschwander. So these kind of first time presentations of artists was a way of presenting the model of international importation through younger artists, through emerging works. And this was a form of legitimization of the museum. I think it's important to point out. Within that context, I was also able to change the discussion and the focus to my neighborhood, by which I mean the museum and anywhere within a 10 or 20 minute block, or 10 or 20 minute walk from the museum. In this case, the East Village movement of the 80s was extremely important and had a powerful influence on my own thinking about art. So being able to present a retrospective of Martin Wong, for example, an artist who died in '99, was essential to developing these ideas. Whoop, wrong way. As was an exhibition a year later, the year before I curated Sildo's retrospective of David Wojnarowicz. Both of these artists died of AIDS. from separate years, and both had various relationships to activism in the social sphere, but also the championing of art from an activist standpoint in a very local sense. Wojnarowicz was famous for his confrontations with religious leaders over sexuality and condom distribution, and Wong was the single greatest collector of graffiti art. Although he was an artist and had no money, he was able to assemble a collection of over 400 examples of graffiti art, which are now in the collection of the Museum of the City of New York. My role at the new museum was for 10 years, more or less from the mid-90s to the mid-aughts. In 2003, I was invited by the Istanbul Biennial to curate that edition, which I had seen in earlier versions and been very, very inspired by. The title of this exhibition was Poetic Justice, and was a direct reflection of, at that time, the developments, the march towards war in the neighboring country of Iraq, and how that was affecting discussion about all cultural interchange at that time. This is the work of Arya Roschamransuk, a Thai artist who at that time was creating performative collaborations in which she would recite her poetry to corpses, cadavers found in the city morgue. And we were presenting this in the Hagia Sophia. So the idea of a kind of Buddhist religious practice presented in a Muslim, formerly Muslim mosque, which was now converted into a cultural museum, had layers of cultural meaning that I think were very poignant to people involved in the exhibition. I'm going to get this right. Similarly, we presented Nalini Malani's work for the first time to a really big international audience in Istanbul, this time in the Cistern, the Istiklal, I'm sorry, I'm forgetting the name, the Cistern underneath the city of Istanbul, which dates back to the Roman era. Doris Salcedo created, I think, one of the most exciting works in this exhibition. It was a piece that reflected on sort of the balance between a time when a society goes to war and the time when the people in the society learned that the society has gone to war. So this kind of tipping balance between chaos and structure, I think, was very well exemplified by her installation of about 2,000 wooden chairs. A few years after doing Istanbul, I organized the Taipei Biennial. The theme I took this time was called Dirty Yoga, and the same idea applied. In this case, Regina Silveira came and presented a large-scale installation on the facade of the museum of migration, of a kind of an epic movement of people from one place to another, in this case, leaving their footprints on the facade of the museum and kind of collecting around the ventilation and other openings as if they were insects leaving their marks as well. At the same time, one of the most provocative aspects of the Taipei Biennial came when we invited Chao Fei from Beijing to make an exhibition in which her father's portraits of Dr. Sun Yat-sen and a Taiwanese collection of portraits of Dr. Sun Yat-sen were presented together as a way of sparking a dialogue about reunification or independence, which is the one political topic that dominates all other discourse in Taipei. And I have to say, Chao Fei was a little surprised to learn when she got to Taipei that the main difference was that the Taiwanese could talk about this all day long in public and fight and argue and publish letters and have protests, whereas she was used to a situation in which there still is really one official perspective presented in public spaces. After Hurricane Katrina decimated New Orleans, I decided to stop doing museum work for several years and reinvent myself as a cultural entrepreneur. The United States has never had an international biennial, and I thought that New Orleans is sort of the perfect model for a World's Fair. And so using the structure of a World's Fair, I developed a structure for financing and then producing a series of what wound up being 2.5 international biennials before I turned the structure over to our board and moved back to the safety of the museum. But this is the map of the museum, of the biennial, or one side of the map, which is tailored after the 1881 Cotton Centennial Exhibition, which was the first ever World's Fair in the United States, and all the venues as well. Artists like Leandro Ehrlich came to New Orleans, developed a work like this one called Too Late, No Escape, which is in the Lower Ninth Ward, right in front of one of the most severe breaches of the levee system. So what you're seeing in the background, that low white wall, is where only 2 years before, billions of tons of water swept through the neighborhood and completely decimated most of the houses in the region. Many artists in Prospect One in particular wanted to get very involved with the local community. I think it was a way for the art world to find a voice, to respond to the situation in New Orleans, which was both political and natural in nature. Gaijin Fujita, a young Japanese-American artist from Los Angeles, came to create a kind of an homage to the city's football team called the Saints, but sort of presented in this 23rd century kind of kabuki troubadour guise. Navin Rawanchakul created a project called Narvin's Party. This was a long-standing investigation into people that had the same name as he did. He was uncomfortable and unhappy with his name growing up, so he's always looked for other Navins. And the funeral notice for Narvin Kimball, in some cases, dropped the R in his name. So Navin thought he'd found the perfect subject and learned along the way that Narvin Kimball, who had been the original trumpet player for the Preservation Hall Jazz Band, the most important classical music band in New Orleans, had died after leaving New Orleans. He died in Georgia, and he never came back and never had a jazz funeral, which was the point that Navin really wanted to present. So the exhibition wound up with sort of posters all over the city, and then a finally delayed, 2-year delayed jazz funeral for Navin. So the notion of the local in New Orleans was very powerful for me. It's a city with a very strong culture. You wind up being drawn into it musically, linguistically, in culinary terms, in terms of the history, because it's very different from the rest of the United States that way. And I became interested in how the local describes a certain formula, which is in a way both timeless and very much of its moment. This is a photograph by Kevin Klein, a local photographer, of a man going to the grocery store in the Bywater neighborhood, dressing the way he dresses every day. This example, which is maybe a very powerful one for those who know New Orleans, is of one of the most important big chiefs of the Mardi Gras Indians, which is an indigenous African-American custom that is a sort of a parallel Mardi Gras, a parallel festival or carnival that happened beyond the reach of white people, so that there was no violence, as often happened when blacks wandered into white New Orleans celebrations. So that was the background. Now here I am, I'm in Orange County, California, which, 100 years ago, Los Angeles was a town of 50,000 people. Today, it's a metropolis of close to 15 million people. It was the fastest growing city in the world for much of its lifetime, and yet, or maybe as a result of, the kind of history of the development of modernism in Los Angeles has been more or less lost, or at least not written completely. And I say this as a New Yorker who spent most of my time understanding at least American art history from the perspective of New York, which sees itself today as the capital of all things artistic, and therefore as Los Angeles as being kind of a belated position. Abstraction arrived late to Los Angeles. Abstract Expressionism arrived 10 years later. Surrealism arrived 10 years later. So the idea that Los Angeles finds itself always trying to catch up with the rest of the world means that I'm in a very interesting position now, because I'm able to approach a sort of history writing through a collection from a revisionist standpoint. So one of the pieces that I've become thought about a lot is this painting from 1945, which shows a migrant worker leaving his breakfast early to get to the oil fields, and describes very accurately the kind of agriculturally driven economy and the dependence on migrant labor that developed the kind of economic powerhouse that, that Los Angeles became by the 70s and 80s. So what I'm trying to do now is look for a more conscious balance between the global paradigm that I was looking at before and the idea that I'm not living in a place where the local is the predominant motif so much as I'm actually dealing with provincialism and this kind of ghost of the idea of being haunted by one's provincial status, that you can't be in the capital and in the provinces at the same time. And so being imported from New York puts me in a position where, on the one hand, I converted the California Biennial, which was a statewide survey, into what is now the California Pacific Triennial that looks at the work of the entire Pacific Rim from the perspective of sort of the future demographic of California, which is transforming itself into a, if you'll pardon the expression, white minority population faster than any other part of the United States. This is Kim Baum doing who has hired an actor to be filmed, painting, showing the viewer how to make an abstract expressionist painting, which, if you want to know, it involves leaning in really closely and screaming, agonized screams as you put the brushstrokes onto the table. The actor does a very good deadpan job of presenting it. At the same time, I found connections that I wasn't aware of. Michael Lin, who currently lives in Shanghai, is an artist I've wanted to work with most of my career. And when I contacted him to ask him if he would participate in the triennial, he told me that he had grown up in Southern California. He had gone to Santa Monica High School. He'd done his graduate and undergraduate studies in Los Angeles and left immediately afterwards. And so this would be 15, 20 years after he left, his debut in his hometown. It was the first opportunity he had. So he came back and created this site-specific installation dealing with the kind of relationship between the transformation of China from the leading economic power of its time to a mostly agrarian state after the Opium Wars of the early 19th century. This is a site-specific work that Sebastian Pries, the Chilean artist, made, kind of talking about the future of cultural spaces in Southern California and how sooner or later, no matter how distinguished the history, every architectural space becomes a parking lot. So this curb and these lines are kind of showing how in the future this will all be archaeology, and what will remain will be the spaces that people will park in. Right now, I've presented an exhibition from the permanent collection that I want to go over a little bit. This is our oldest modernist work in the collection. It's by Stanton Mcdonald Wright, an American who worked in Paris from 1910 to 1914, co-authored a movement called Synchromism with a fellow American, Morgan Russell, and moved back to Los Angeles in 1919 to promote the cause of modern art and abstraction. We have several works of his in our collection, but this is sort of the beginning of the voicing of a spirit of the avant-garde within California art. A lot of what was considered modernism was imported from Europe. This is Oskar Fischinger, who is well known before he came to Los Angeles in the 30s as one of the most experimental filmmakers in the world. He practically invented abstract animation as an art form, came to Los Angeles hoping that he could work with Disney or other studios, found very little opportunity, and turned his efforts to making abstraction and promoting, as did Mcdonald Wright, the idea of modernity in Los Angeles. This is the work of Emil Bistrom, not from Los Angeles, but rather Santa Fe. This artist is mostly self-taught. He co-founded a transcendental painting group in Taos, New Mexico at the end of the 30s, and became a very important voice for a kind of a mystical approach to the development of abstraction. Backing up. Most of what we consider modernism in California happened in San Francisco in the first part of the 20th century. David Park, for example, was an abstract expressionist who at the end of the 50s was really the first to turn to figurative imagery at a time when everyone around him was an abstract expressionist, and he wanted to make work that would make the viewer as uncomfortable as possible. Sorry. Nathan Oliveira, also from the Bay Area, kind of combined figuration and a more gestural abstract expressionist style and approach, and he remains for many the sort of quintessence of modernist painting in the Bay Area. Probably the most important artist in San Francisco in mid-century is Bruce Conner, an artist who worked almost entirely in assemblage and photography, although he's known for making as well very short experimental films. And the museum has a couple of major works of his that, you know, for me, really helped to identify the museum more as a place of collecting and assembling a history that's not yet local, but still connected to the region of California during the mid-century period. The first avant-garde in Los Angeles is hard-edge geometric abstraction. And I think that the time frame that we're talking about, the late 40s through the 50s, will sound familiar to many people who have followed a parallel history here in Brazilian contemporary abstraction. This is Helen Lundberg, an artist who I doubt many of you have ever heard of. In the 30s, she invented an American surrealistic form, which she wanted to base on found objects in the real world, and became, with her husband, Lorser Feidelson, one of the most important abstract artists, but someone who always connected that pursuit to landscape. This is Frederick Hammersley, another artist who in the 50s and 60s developed an extremely reductivist approach to abstraction. And he and the next artist, John McLaughlin, are probably the artists who are single-handedly responsible for the development of the light and space movement. And that was a movement more related to the 70s, but where the artists like James Turrell, Robert Irwin, became the first well-known generation of Los Angeles artists outside of the region, although the roots for their work in the hard-edge school of the 1950s has never really been explored until now, and it's one of the projects that I'm currently developing. So Doug Wheeler, whose work you see here, is one of the founders of the light and space movement. Until recently, Wheeler was not recognized as being nearly as significant as Robert Irwin or James Turrell. In just the last few years, that's changing. I discovered this work in our collection. It's been sitting in our vault since 1975, and I contacted the artist who came down, had a look at it, was very surprised that it belonged to us, and so we've just presented it last week for the first time since it was made, which was in the late 1960s. The museum's collection, the museum was started in 1962, so it's 52 years old this year, but the collection began in 1970 when a local financial group called AVCO quickly divested of its art collection and gave the entire collection to the museum. Among some of the works, like sculptures by Louise Nevelson, was this really remarkable painted sculpture by Via Selmans, who is a very well-known and respected artist, first associated with pop art, and then later with a more contemplative approach to landscape. John Baldessari was an artist who showed frequently through the early years of the museum. For a long time before there was MoCA or before there was the Hammer Museum, the only museum activity for contemporary art was either the Los Angeles County Museum of Art or the Newport Harbor Art Museum in Newport Beach. So artists like Baldessari, Ed Ruscha, often had their first museum exhibitions at our museum, which is why we have this fairly wonderful piece by Baldessari, which is a kind of a parody of Max Kozloff's writing style in art form. The Feminist Avant-Garde, which in this case is represented by a New York artist, Joan Semmel, kind of begins with the photography of the body and trying to readapt Renoir's feeling of intimacy and the painting of the female body by turning it into self-portraiture and making the body into a landscape, which is partly unfamiliar. The development of video and performance, I think, was a second vanguard that was very influential in Los Angeles at that time. In this case, we have many early videos by artists like Barbara T. Smith, Paul McCarthy, Martha Rossler, Suzanne Lacey, and other very prominent figures in the early 70s Los Angeles scene. On more recent years, we've collected the work of Alan Sekula, a photographer who recently passed away in Los Angeles, but is probably the most important photographer in the United States for documenting the invisible machinery of global economy. In this case, we see sugarcane workers in Calais, France, unloading bundles of sugarcane from a boat. A more local phenomenon would be the work of Kim Dingle, a feminist artist who really emerged in the 90s with an idea of sort of the abject, tortured self. She's created 2 self-portraits, one black, one white, as 2-year-olds, as terrible toddlers in their crib. If you look at the space around them, you can see that they have created a lot of destruction and mayhem, and now they're just waiting patiently in their crib for you, the spectator, to turn your back so they can attack again. Catherine Opie, a fairly well-known photographer in Los Angeles, began her career by photographing sexual minorities. In this case, the drag king phenomenon of women who go through at least part of their active life presenting themselves to the world as men. And with the facial features of men, despite the fact that they can be recognized as female to most viewers. Charles Ray, probably better known to audiences like yourselves for a very developed and detail-oriented, almost classical approach to the figure, started off in the late 80s. This is his first figurative sculpture, transforming his face onto that of a department store mannequin, which he then dressed in his own clothes and presented in this very uncanny position in the middle of the gallery, looking like he's selling cheap sports clothing. The piece I'm going to end on, and I think it's really kind of where the local and the global really converge in terms of our collection, is this piece by Chris Burden. Chris Burden is from Los Angeles originally, but he's specifically educated and lived many years in Orange County, very close to the museum. He studied at the University of California at Irvine. His first job was as a preparator at our museum. So it was very interesting that 15 years later, the museum would make the first important purchase of Burden's work to be in a museum collection. This work, which is called A Tale of Two Cities, was first developed in 1981, and then it was purchased in an expanded version by the museum in 1987 in preparation for Chris Burden's first museum retrospective in 1988. I just want to point out my predecessor at that time was Paul Schimmel, who later went on for many years to be an extremely influential curator at MoCA in Los Angeles for more than 25 years. The reason I think this is an essential work is not just that the landscape looks like Southern California, which it does, but because Southern California is the place where the aerospace industry had its greatest growth during the post-war period. So most of the weapons used from World War II right up through the invasion of Iraq were developed on the West Coast by industries that grew almost out of nothing in the build-up to the Pacific Theater and the European theater of World War II. So the aerospace industry was a very exciting thing for a little boy. And like many little boys, Chris Burden collected hundreds of toy soldiers. When he was a young man, hundreds became thousands. And he kept collecting without really knowing what he was going to do with them. And then finally, the scenario, as you see it, came about when, in the early 80s, he was asked to make a large installation for the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. And he began thinking about war as it was changing. and how going from sort of nationalistic wars to wars of choice, say from the 40s into the 80s, what became more and more prominent was the role of the armaments industry, the military-industrial complex that actually builds and sells these weapon systems. So what you see in this scenario is big city on one side, and this is little city. And big city has just bought a lot of imported armaments in the form of Japanese toy soldiers that are actually going to win the war for them. So it's on the verge of a decisive battle in which little city is about to be crushed. You stand there on the outside and you're looking at approximately 5,000 toys that are laying out every aspect of this decisive battle in enormous detail. And the piece has this attraction-repulsion for many visitors who are appalled with the literal material of war presented in such a playful way, but at the same time can't resist the temptation to pick up the binoculars and look very closely at all the details of every tank, every soldier, every weapon that's reproduced there in detail. So I think that my talk hasn't directly addressed the idea of legitimization as such, but I also feel that with a piece like Chris Burden's Tale of Two Cities, you have a symbiotic relationship between the artist who's trying to build a career slowly. And in 1981, Chris Burden had very, very little of a reputation other than a sort of a notoriety for having had himself shot in the arm a few years earlier when he was still a student at Irvine University. But at the same time, it's the museum also, by being able to support an emerging artist by an acquisition at a sensitive period in their career, can make a very powerful difference years later when the artist is in the position that someone like Chris Burden is today, and we're the sole owners of a piece that was really a turning point in his career. So this, as I said, is currently on view along with about 100 other works from the collection, kind of exploring the aspect of the avant-garde and how we've been looking at it inadvertently over the last century in developing the collection. Those are my remarks for now. I just want to thank you all for your attention, and I hope we have some time for some questions.
Thank you, Dan. Well, I hope we'll also have time now to address, obviously, the problem of legitimization in different ways. So I think it's a very good, well, there's a lot of questions I could ask you about, I mean, this wealth of material that you have shown us. And the first thing that strikes me, and I would like to reclaim from your talk, is those different positions you have been through, right? I mean, in terms of, say, different ways of operating this conjunction between, or disjunction between the contemporary art world, art history, and the local. I mean, this is played out in a different way when you are obviously curating a biennial or doing a project like Prospect. Obviously in a different way as well if you are in an institution in New York, like the new museum, the main institution in New York. And clearly it's a different thing when you are in the Orange County Museum that's kind of more devoted to this, as you say, this local history, perhaps to this idea of making sense of a local history, not simply as an accessory to a larger narrative that we are more familiar with. So perhaps the first thing I'd like to hear from you is how do you think those dimensions, right, the contemporary, the different kinds of pressures, right, to insert oneself into the contemporary art world, to reclaim and make sense of local history, right, to think of oneself, of one's position in relation to art history. How do you, in your experience, how have you kind of managed this with these different institutional situations? I wonder if.
Well, I think one of the ways to do it is to start with the collection that you have and do as thorough as possible an analysis. Our museum has about 3,200 objects. And I would say that we add to the collection about 100 pieces a year. That seems to be the rate at which the collection is expanding. So part of the prioritization is to see what the museum has done in the past, see what the strengths of the collection are, but in particular look at the weaknesses. Look at artists who have been left out and in some way try to complete the history or fill in the history that's been left for you by others. At the same time, I think that being actively involved in the local gallery and exhibition scene is essential, because as a curator, you're also trying to construct a picture for later use of what's happening at this moment. So most of the acquisitions that I have done have been of younger artists, emerging artists in the Los Angeles area, or they've been of artists who are no longer alive. There seems to be not so much opportunity yet to kind of expand the areas of the collection of artists who are in mid-career or older, because those are at the very place where the museum's collection is the strongest. So kind of filling in the art of the 60s, 70s, and 80s is not as important a priority right now as trying to look back and find these weaknesses, especially the kind of revised history that is growing and flourishing in Los Angeles, and then trying to see what's happening right now, right this very minute. Who are the artists who are affecting the discourse in the most profound way in the community, and how can the museum support them, either by making exhibitions or collecting the work, or hopefully doing both.
But when you come to in this, when you think about an altogether different setting, right, the biennial, the Istanbul Biennial, or other ones, especially when you consider this growing similarities between the biennial and what we are in now, right, an art fair. We are here in a symposium, in an art fair, as we are talking before. We are also doing some legitimization here, unavoidably. And where the problem is a different one, right? It's not necessarily about dealing with the local history, but of inserting oneself within a certain kind of global landscape with all the problematic aspects that has as well. So I wonder where do we stand with this idea of how we relate to the object here? Because it's a different thing when you when you are a curator buying on behalf of a public museum, right? And you are dealing with, as I say, with local gallery scene, and this is a different relationship to the market than when you are a curator in the Istanbul Biennial or in another kind of one of these stops in our contemporary jet set. So perhaps.
Well, I think one of the things to emphasize here is that the relationship between the spectator and the artist studio is kind of a relic of the past. I think we all know that not very many people beyond the real specialists get to go into the artist studio and experience the sort of site of creativity in a direct way. So what we have instead is the gallery, the local gallery, the sort of space where exhibitions happen, where a kind of an education, passing on of values of connoisseurship take place. And to me, that's sort of the site that never changes. So a local gallery in Rio, or a local gallery in Los Angeles, or a local gallery in Istanbul are doing remarkably similar work in their communities, not just promoting the sale of specific works or specific artists, but also promoting the values of connoisseurship. Because ultimately, the collection doesn't stay forever in private hands. Ultimately, if it's a good collection, it goes somehow back to the state or some kind of a public institution to be preserved for posterity. I mean, we are in an age now where private collectors have their own museums, and that's another phenomenon, that we could think about. But right now, I think it's the gallery that allows that sort of space, kind of safe, secure, protected space for a new history to be written, whether it's a kind of revisionist history of the past or a history that's still in the process of forming itself. So kind of comparing that to a situation of the art fair, it's almost hard to comment, because what we're looking at here are hundreds and hundreds of objects, all of which have different histories and different context, and they're jumbled together in a way that doesn't really allow the separation to happen. So I think that the legitimization of the deal or the sale of the artwork is something we're all implicitly involved in. But I think there's something more important taking place, which is the promotion of the values of appreciation of artists and the support of their work, not just with the sale, but in many other ways too. The work you do, the work I do as a curator, you really want to give the artist a voice or a platform to reach the public.
But there's also other things that need to be legitimized, I guess, like cities, right? So, for example, I guess that the relationship between an Orange County museum as a local museum to this is a different thing than, say, when you reclaim the model like the World Fair to talk about prospect, and you comment that the U.S. didn't have a major biennial, so kind of having to have a biennial is a different thing than kind of dealing with a local museum. And it's kind of interesting to hear you speak about this belated position of LA, because I guess that here in Rio, we also experience a sort of a belated, a complex of being in a belated position, even though our art history is relatively central, at least for Brazilian standards. But nevertheless, I guess our cultural capital here was often kind of seen as being, and it's what's truly less evident than in São Paulo, say, and a phenomenon like the art fair here or the new museums in the port area and other spaces do play a strong role in kind of rebranding the city as this global phenomenon, which is obviously a very different thing than dealing with a local art history, right? It's a different kind of pressure. It's like making the city more akin to other cities against kind of thinking about its potentially disruptive singularity of its history vis-a-vis other ones, isn't it? I mean,
I think the history can only be disruptive up until the time that it's embraced by the institutional structures for writing art history, at which point you then have a turn, and the version of history that was outside and disruptive becomes institutionalized and centralized as the official history. So we were talking a little bit before about, you know, certain movements in Brazilian art. They were always recognized by historians and experts and collectors, and now have become so standardized in terms of their importance that younger curators or historians, I think, struggle to find a new approach or a new perspective that they can take, or should they go on to find another generation that was lost? But I think the feelings of belatedness with regard to history, it's a conversation I've had many times in Brazil and other countries in South America. I think culturally, and if you want psychosocially, it's a very legitimate phenomenon. In terms of history, however, it's an illusion. You know, the idea that modernism happened a few years later in the Americas than it did in Europe is meaningless. There's no point to saying, well, this is where it happened first, and then it came here, and then it came here. I think our vision of what the history of the 20th century was like no longer prioritizes firstness. It no longer says, you know, it's not as if the first person to paint a Cubist painting is the one who's the champion, and then everyone else gets a consolation prize. I think now the approaches to art history really have de-hierarchized or kind of turned a lot or inverted a lot of these notions of what is recognized, what is an official history, and what is still waiting to be validated by future historians.
It's kind of it's one last question before we open to the public. You use an expression that I found very interesting. You said you spoke about art from an activist standpoint when you were talking about in the beginning of your talk, and that's interesting because say if we recall, like, say, Peter Berger's theory of the avant-garde or something like that, we will recall also that institutionalization is opposed in this kind of framework from praxis, by the vital praxis, and obviously we are in a scenario now where the problem is that the institutions are trying to internalize and cope with that somehow, and this somehow varies a lot, I guess, right? How these kind of art practices that try to have some kind of vital connection to something that is not simply the art world are being kind of internalized by institutions. And I wonder if you have dealt with that from different positions also throughout your trajectory. You gave a few examples here. Again, this kind of example in New York or the local in LA. I wonder if you would have anything to say about curatorial strategies for dealing with this, for not institutionalizing without neutralizing, perhaps, which is a huge challenge, of course.
I don't think that institutions are inherently in danger of neutralizing activism. What I do think is that we have certain categorizations of artistic practice in which some things are considered political and other things are not. And I'm finding that distinction, like the global and local distinction, to be increasingly meaningless. I don't understand what makes something political and something else. I understand what makes something political. I don't understand what makes something not political. And I think artistic activity in particular falls into an area in which its primary effects are on the viewer's consciousness. You know, we can talk about taste and other issues, but I think that in the end, the artist is the author of a very politically oriented action simply by making art in the first place. So to the degree that the institution can neutralize, and I think it's very limited, I think that it's going to happen across the board. And if you think of the museum as a reliquary or a container of art, you know, to be protected for the future, I think you have some dangers there. If you think of the institution of the museum, though, primarily as an educational enterprise, as something that's there to disseminate and expand on ideas and publish and promote scholarship, then I think it's less obvious that the object of beauty and the object of political activism are somehow distinct animals, which is, right now I think we've found ourselves in a tendency to subscribe to that binary without really examining it anymore.
I think it's time for us to open. I think we can now open for questions from the audience.
No questions?
Okay. No. Otherwise, essa pergunta eu posso. I can ask one more question. I mean, I have no problem with that. I was also wondering, I mean, taking the cue of this attempt of undoing certain distinctions which are artificial, and once again relating to the fact that we are here in an art fair, I wonder how would you see the distinction between collecting and consuming, especially if the word collecting, in the way you use it in the contemporary world, kind of deals with this distinction or mystifies it. I tend to think that in the sense that collecting has been played by people like, say, Walter Benjamin and others, as distinct from realizing a use value. It has often been played against consumption, but I wonder if nowadays the word collection hasn't fall back to a certain degree, designating a certain kind of consumption, or if at least to mystify or blur the borders between that. And I mean, and of course, and again, collecting for a public institution and collecting for a private institution also will be bound to have certain distinctions in this sense, won't they?
I think it's an important distinction to make right now because of the terms of the market today. I think we're all sort of aware that there's a sort of a bubble economy taking place in contemporary art, and you know, the degree of rampant speculation in younger artists and the revived phenomenon of the flippers, you know, the people who buy younger artists in volume to be able to sell them soon afterwards to someone else who they know for a greatly increased profit.
And funds nowadays, right?
Exactly, and so the notion that this is a liquid asset and that's something to be moved from hands to hand for speculative financial purposes, that is a practice where 99% of us have to sit outside and just sort of observe that going on. So I think that's what's responsible for a lot of the suspicion and and doubts and anxieties concerning contemporary collecting practice. I think that the people who collect art in order to make a difference, in order to support new ideas, or in order to eventually give that collection to their favorite local museum, I think those are the kinds of practices on which the most important museums' collections are built. But it's almost invisible. What you see in the papers or what you read about at the art fairs are the new prices or the new sales at the auctions and who's buying what for how much. What you don't see is the quiet process of works that are passing from private hands into sort of public collections. So again, I think it's very unfortunate that the hype around the bubble economy for contemporary art right now has created a sort of resistance to the very act of collecting, in the belief that by exchanging money for art, you're indulging in some kind of a corrupt practice. And so I would sort of blame the market for producing an environment in which those sort of suspicions and doubts seem to be rampant.
There's a question there? Question there?
Obrigado. Dan, it's in English. I've noticed with your work, I've followed your careers since the early 90s, living in New York. Higher? Sure, okay, sorry. You've been at the vanguard of, this is difficult. Okay, you've been at the vanguard of being quite a political curator, in my estimation, with the David Vujanovic show, which was fairly highly contentious at the time, as I remember it, with both gay causes and minorities in what you've taken and brought to the forefront with the new museum. And your move to New Orleans, it seems that you are a very political curator, as far as I can see. With the new posting and with the collection that you're working with, where do you see it actually going, or what would be your ambition in taking it? In which direction would you like to take it?
That's a great question. For those of you who didn't hear, I think the question had to do with the sort of political aspects of my past curating and how what I plan to do now in my current post to extend that. I'm living in an almost entirely Republican-dominated environment. Orange County is famous for being a place where conservatives could get away from the more liberal Los Angeles and sort of close themselves up in gated communities in the suburbs, and vote for Ronald Reagan and vote for George Bush and sort of promote this dying view of conservatism as it continues to show up in certain parts of the United States. I feel that as a curator, the role of the political in this case is both more overt and somewhat hidden. For example, in the biennial that I showed, the California Pacific Triennial, I invited an artist from Tijuana named Hugo Crosswaite to create an installation in the front spaces of the gallery. And the piece was really dealing with border culture and seeing it from the perspective of Tijuana, which is exactly the perspective that is foreign or unfamiliar to many people in Orange County. And the piece had some political dimensions to it. There were certainly some messages there that were embedded that were meant to point to particular political figures and point the figure of accusation at them. But I understood in the process that that wasn't what was deemed political by local viewers. The mere fact of foregrounding a Tijuana-centric perspective on the border as opposed to a California-centric perspective was deemed almost unbearably radical in some ways. So to me, to even represent cultural perspectives that are distinct from the status quo and that seem to be the other in the eyes of the audience can provoke this response that's quite visceral. So I'm not answering your question because you asked how I plan to make this happen. And there are some exhibitions that I'm working on for the future, one of which deals with AIDS as the first sort of global visual language. You know, that artists dealing with AIDS spoke to each other across global frontiers before any other format for that work really seemed to happen. And this is clearly an exhibition that I think is perfect for this museum, but I also understand that, you know, getting from here to there involves also looking at kind of more classically or conventionally museological problems along the way, because one provides the context for the other. It's almost, you want to give your audience art that they recognize so that they'll feel safe, and then you want to hit them with something that's much more challenging and potentially disruptive, because in the end, you're trying to expand their boundaries as much as you're trying to expand your own. I hope I answered your question.
I look forward to reading or being able to actually see the AIDS exhibition. It should be well overdue and it should be quite fascinating.
Thank you. Thanks.
Okay, thanks for coming. Thanks to Dan and Sergio for this wonderful dialogue. And we are just a reminder that we are preparing two more conversations tomorrow afternoon from 4 to 6. So you are more than welcome to come back tomorrow afternoon to the auditorium and hear the two conversations. One is between Bartomeu Marí, the director of Museum of Contemporary Art in Barcelona, and Kaila Cabanya. And the other one is going to be conducted by myself and the Colombian collector Rafael Negro. So thanks again for coming, and have a good night.
Thank you.